You think you're smart?" He scoffed, slamming a thick contract onto the counter, so hard the silver napkin holder rattled. "Then prove it." The words cut through the clatter of dishes and the low hum of the café like a gunshot. Forks stopped midair. Conversations froze. Even the cook leaned halfway out the kitchen door. But Imani Carter didn't blink. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped forward, and started flipping through the pages. 5 seconds later, she pointed at a clause his entire legal team had missed. And from that moment on, nothing about her life or his would ever be the same. Imani Carter had worked the morning shift at Old Harbor Café for nearly 2 years. Most regulars barely noticed her unless their coffee was late or their eggs came out wrong. She moved through the narrow aisles with practiced speed, apron smudged, hair tied back, eyes always scanning. 19 years old, college dropout, minimum wage. To the world, that was the whole story. But what no one knew, not her manager, not the regulars, not even her closest coworker, was that Imani had once been a pre-law student at a top university, that she used to fall asleep reading federal court rulings, that she spent her breaks now reading contracts on her phone just to keep her mind sharp. She kept it quiet. It didn't matter anyway. No one at the cafe was asking. That morning, Julian Reyes walked in with the storm behind his eyes. Founder and CEO of Reyes Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing tech empires in the country. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't the type, but he needed quiet. And apparently, he liked the biscuits. He took the corner booth, ordered black coffee, then spent an hour scowling at a stack of papers. That stack, a proposed merger with a rival firm, was the product of months of legal work and millions in advisor fees. And still, something about it was wrong. He could feel it, but he couldn't name it. He flagged her down again, more annoyed than before. She brought the refill, and that's when it happened. He caught the way she glanced at the papers. Too sharp, too fast. He snapped, asked if she thought she was smarter than him. Before she could answer, he slammed the contract on the counter and dared her to read it. The room went still. Imani looked at him, then at the papers. She leaned in, flipped the last few pages, and pointed. It took her less than a minute. That clause tucked into the indemnity section shifted liability to his company in a way that no one had noticed. If the merger went south, he'd be left holding the bag. She didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She just said quietly that it should be renegotiated. He stared at her, the entire room waiting. Something in him shifted right then, and without saying a word, he slid the contract back toward her and asked her to keep reading. Word spread inside the company faster than anyone expected. A billionaire CEO taking legal notes from a waitress? It sounded like a rumor made to be laughed off, but it wasn't. Julian Reyes didn't just take her advice. He canceled the deal that same afternoon. His top legal team was humiliated. They'd billed hundreds of hours combing through that contract. They'd missed what she saw in less than a minute. At Reyes Dynamics, whispers started. Some were impressed. Most were threatened. Who was she? What were her credentials? Where did she come from? HR assumed she was a relative. Legal thought it was some stunt. But Julian knew what he'd seen: clarity under pressure. Raw logic. No fear. He invited her to visit the corporate office, not as a guest, but as a consultant. She refused. Said she still had 3 shifts to cover that week. That answer, oddly, only made him more curious. So he came back, 3 days in a row. Each time, he brought new documents, NDAs, patents, proposal drafts, and each time Imani cut through the jargon like a blade. She didn't just find flaws. She asked questions none of his lawyers had even considered. At one point, she rewrote an entire clause on the back of a receipt. Reyes folded that paper and kept it in his wallet. But not everyone was impressed. Inside Reyes Dynamics, senior staff bristled. They'd spent years climbing that ladder, earning their place. Now, a teenager in an apron was correcting them. Meetings grew colder. Eyes rolled when her name came up. One executive even said, offhand, that she was just a fluke lucky with one contract, dangerous with the rest. Julian didn't answer him directly. Instead, he handed Imani a pass to the 34th floor, the company's legal R&D lab, and told her she could use it whenever she wanted. No job title, no salary, just space to think. She showed up after her café shifts, still in uniform. Some nights, she stayed past midnight. She didn't care who doubted her. She knew what she saw. And Julian, for reasons even he couldn't yet explain, was beginning to believe that she might be the smartest person in the building. By the third week, the tests began. Quiet ones at first. Memos slipped onto her desk with key clauses missing. Contracts redlined so heavily they were almost unreadable. Reports with buried errors meant to trip her up. No one admitted it, but she wasn't stupid. They wanted her to fail, to expose her as an amateur who got lucky. But Imani didn't take the bait. She studied every word, flagged every trick, and returned every file with notes so clear they became office-wide examples. Still, the skepticism didn't fade. One VP even suggested they run her analysis through the firm's AI tools to check for accuracy. It was meant as an insult. But when they did, the system flagged her work as more precise than half the paid team. Julian barely reacted. He just forwarded the results to the board. But Imani noticed the stares. Some were impressed. Some were waiting for her to crack. What they didn't know was that she'd already cracked years ago, when she dropped out of school to care for her sick mother, when student loans piled up, and nights got longer, and food got scarce. She studied contracts by candlelight while her mother slept. She read law blogs during bus rides and worked double shifts just to afford textbooks she could barely keep open from exhaustion. She didn't come from a place of privilege. She came from pressure. And pressure, she had learned, could do two things. It could crush you or turn you into something unbreakable. So when they threw problems at her, she didn't flinch. She solved. Again and again, Julian began assigning her to special projects. Not officially, she still wasn't on payroll, but his calendar now had blocks labeled IC Review. One of those projects involved compliance frameworks for a new app Reyes Dynamics was prototyping. The idea was a public-facing legal tool that could simplify everyday documents, leases, job contracts, student loans. The team struggled to make it clear and usable. Imani tore the whole model apart and rebuilt it overnight. Not only did her version work, it connected every clause to plain language definitions and even offered alternatives for risky terms. Julian stared at it for almost a minute. Then he asked the one question that would change everything. If we built this your way, would you lead it? The offer didn't come with strings, but it came with weight. Leading a project inside Reyes Dynamics meant stepping fully into the spotlight and into the line of fire. Imani said yes, not because she felt ready, but because she knew the people she was doing it for couldn't afford for her to say no. The app would be called Clause Clear. Its mission was simple: make legal knowledge accessible to those the system usually ignored. Working-class families, young people, immigrants. The kind of people who got taken advantage of because they didn't speak the language of contracts. From day one, she faced resistance. Senior engineers questioned her decisions. Legal veterans asked if she had the right to even lead. One exec told her to her face that apps don't change systems, and girls like her don't change companies. But Imani had seen what happened when people didn't understand what they were signing. Evictions, debt traps, job losses. She knew that ignorance wasn't a flaw, it was engineered. And Clause Clear could disrupt that, so she fought for every feature. Built a team of misfits and overlooked interns who believed in the mission. She wrote every clause herself, pulling all-nighters at the café after closing, sketching out logic flows between cleaning tables. When the design team said it couldn't be done in one interface, she broke it down into modular tiles they could code. When legal said it was too risky, she cited precedent from state rulings they hadn't even considered. When the board asked for a roadmap, she handed them a timeline drawn on receipt paper with phase goals, test dates, and rollout plans annotated with footnotes. Slowly, the resistance shifted. Doubt turned to curiosity. Curiosity turned to respect. Her team started hitting benchmarks no one thought they could. At one point, A developer pulled her aside and said they'd never worked this hard for anyone because no one had ever made it feel this personal. Imani didn't smile much. She was too focused. But late at night, she'd catch herself staring at the Claws Clear logo on the test build. Not with pride, but with pressure. This wasn't just a job, it was her shot. Her answer to every locked door she'd ever stood in front of. And she wasn't going to let it slip. As Claws Clear moved from prototype to pre-launch, the scrutiny around Imani intensified. Journalists began sniffing around the story. A legal education app developed by a college dropout waitress turned consultant? It sounded too good to be true. The headlines hovered somewhere between praise and skepticism. Some outlets framed her as a prodigy. Others questioned whether Julian Reyes was using her as a token, a convenient poster child for diversity in tech. Imani read every article. She didn't care much about the praise, but the doubt stuck with her like a stone in her shoe. And inside Reyes Dynamics, that doubt took root in dangerous ways. A senior compliance officer submitted a memo directly to the board, questioning Claws Clear's legal viability. He claimed it oversimplified law, potentially exposing the company to lawsuits. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The memo was meant to stop the launch. When Imani read it, she didn't argue. She asked for 10 minutes at the next internal review meeting. She walked in, stood in front of a dozen executives who barely acknowledged her presence weeks before, and went line by line through the memo. For every objection, she had a counterexample. For every risk, she had a mitigation strategy. She even included a parallel use case from a federal education initiative that validated her model. By the end of the 10 minutes, the room was silent. And then, for the first time, Julian Reyes spoke directly to the board. He said Claws Clear would move forward, and that if they had a problem with that, they could consider their future at Reyes Dynamics optional. It was a rare moment of public backing, and it was a turning point. Imani didn't just survive a takedown attempt. She shut it down with facts, with calm, with a command of the material so complete that no one dared question it again, at least, not out loud. But behind closed doors, a quiet bitterness began to spread. The kind that came from ego, from being proved wrong, from power shifting in a way the old guard didn't like. They couldn't stop her directly. But that didn't mean they were done trying. The next move wouldn't be in a boardroom. It would be personal, and it would cut deeper than she expected. It started with small things. Her security badge suddenly stopped working on certain floors. Calendar invites for meetings she was supposed to lead never arrived. A quiet reshuffling of project files meant she no longer had edit access to her own documents. No one admitted anything. IT blamed system errors. Admin staff shrugged. But it was a pattern, and Imani saw it clearly. Someone high up was trying to box her out without ever saying her name. And then came the real blow. During a company-wide strategy session, a newly hired executive presented a slide labeled Claws Clear Future Vision. The branding was familiar. The interface was hers, but her name was nowhere on the screen. The presenter spoke for nearly 15 minutes about innovation, inclusion, and legal transparency, quoting lines Imani herself had written without mentioning the person who had created the entire foundation. She sat there, in the front row, expression steady, heart pounding. When it ended, applause followed. Shallow, polite, completely detached from the truth. Julian wasn't there that day. He was speaking at a tech summit overseas, and in his absence, the vultures had moved in. That night, Imani didn't go home. She stayed in the lab, surrounded by whiteboards and scribbled notes, eyes locked on the Claws Clear prototype still running in debug mode. For the first time since the café, she wondered if they'd ever truly let her win, if they'd let her build it only so they could take it once it was finished. But then she remembered who Claws Clear was for. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for the board, or the press, or the executives. It was for the kids signing student loans they didn't understand, for the tenants handed eviction notices in fine print, for the single moms with predatory contracts and no one to explain them. And with that, her focus returned. She copied the prototype to a private server, locked the source code under her name, and began building a full documentation file that proved authorship and design lineage. If they wanted to erase her, they'd have to rewrite history, and she wasn't going to make that easy. The next morning, she walked back into the building, eyes forward, ready. Because she knew now this wasn't just about launching an app. This was about claiming space they never meant for her to take. Julian Reyes returned 3 days later to a company that felt different. The lobby greetings were stiffer, the energy colder. And when he asked for a progress update on Clause Clear, he noticed something strange. People hesitated. They danced around the topic, offered vague answers, cited internal reviews and restructuring plans. None of it made sense. So he called Imani. She didn't pick up. Not the first time, not the second. On the third call, she answered. Her voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. She told him the truth, the erasure, the interference, the silent freezing out that had started the moment he left the building. And then, without bitterness, she told him she was still building, still working, still finishing what she started. He didn't respond with sympathy or outrage. He simply asked when she could meet him and then cleared his entire schedule. What followed was a closed-door session in his office that lasted nearly 2 hours. No assistants, no board members, just him and her. When they emerged, something had shifted. Julian Reyes was no longer treating Clause Clear as a side project or a quiet investment. He sent out a company-wide memo that afternoon. Effective immediately, Clause Clear would be its own division. Not a product, not a pilot, a division reporting directly to him, and Imani Carter would lead it as interim director. The announcement landed like a bomb. No one could argue with the results anymore. The prototype was already outperforming internal benchmarks. Early user testing in select schools had shown massive comprehension gains in underserved communities. But still, the resistance didn't vanish. Some called it reckless. Others called it political. There were whispers about favoritism, about optics, about how this never would have happened if she were anyone else. And maybe they were right. Maybe it did happen, because she was who she was. A young Black woman from a working-class background with no credentials, no corporate polish, and no reason to wait her turn. Maybe that's exactly why it needed to happen. The moment she stepped into her new office, a spare corner room with no windows but a door that locked, she didn't celebrate. She opened her laptop, opened the prototype, and started writing the user guide herself. Because the product wasn't the victory. The victory would be making sure anyone, anywhere, could open that app and finally understand what the system never wanted them to see. Clause Clear's official launch was scheduled for the first week of fall. The event would be small, internal, just a signal to the board and press that the app was live and ready for rollout. But Imani had a different idea. She proposed launching it at Lincoln High, a public school in the heart of Milwaukee, where over 80% of students qualified for free lunch and almost none had access to legal education. At first, the board rejected the idea. Too low profile, too risky, no press visibility. But Julian overruled them. He said if Clause Clear was built for people without access, then it had to start where access was lowest. And so, on a crisp October morning, Imani stood in a school auditorium in front of a crowd of teens in hoodies, worn backpacks, and skeptical stares. She didn't wear a suit. She didn't try to impress them. She opened by asking how many had ever signed something they didn't fully understand, a lease, a loan, even a social media waiver. Every hand went up. Then she pulled out her phone, opened Clause Clear, and walked them through a real-world scenario, a first job contract with hidden non-compete language buried deep inside. As she explained what it meant, kids leaned forward. They asked questions. They shared stories. One student asked if it worked for immigration forms. Another said their mom could have used this 2 years ago when they got evicted. By the end, the auditorium was buzzing not with applause, but with recognition. They saw themselves in it. They saw how power had always been hidden in words they weren't taught to read. And now, they had a tool that spoke their language. Later that afternoon, the app's servers logged a massive spike in downloads across local IPs. Schools called, libraries called, nonprofits wanted access codes. Clear wasn't just live, it was alive. And Imani? She didn't go back to headquarters. She stayed at the school for hours, answering questions, helping kids navigate the app. That night, when she finally got home, her inbox was full press inquiries, speaking requests, even a message from a national education coalition asking if she'd consider a partnership. But she ignored them for a moment and stared at the download tracker instead. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Real people, real usage, not numbers in a report lives. And all she could think was, this is only the beginning. The success couldn't be ignored anymore. Clear was being talked about on morning news segments, legal blogs, education panels. But with recognition came pressure and new challenges. The first came in the form of a cease and desist letter from a national law firm claiming the app constituted unauthorized legal interpretation. It was a scare tactic, legally flimsy but loud enough to make headlines. The board panicked. Some wanted to suspend the app immediately. Others feared lawsuits, bad press, stock fluctuation. Imani stayed quiet while the arguments flew. Then, when the room paused long enough for her to speak, she calmly laid out her response. She had built Clear not to give legal advice, but to give legal understanding the same kind offered in thousands of self-help guides, library resources, and public education materials. She quoted statute, she cited precedent, she even pointed out that the same firm sending the threat had previously supported educational tools for corporate clients that did far more interpreting than her app ever did. By the end of the meeting, the legal team sided with her. The app stayed online, but that wasn't the real victory. The real moment came weeks later, when the same law firm quietly withdrew its complaint and sent a private inquiry asking if Clear would consider a licensing agreement. Imani declined, politely, because Clear wasn't built to be licensed by the gatekeepers. It was built to tear the gates off. In the background, something else was shifting too. Universities began reaching out. One in particular, the very school Imani had once dropped out of, offered her a full scholarship to return and finish her degree. She said yes. Not because she needed the degree anymore, but because she wanted to sit in those classrooms. Not to learn, but to challenge what was being taught, to ask why no one ever built Clear before she did. As she prepared for the fall semester, she also kept leading the app's evolution, building new features, expanding language access, and launching a youth ambassador program to train high school students to use the app in their own communities. What began as a dare in a diner had become a national tool for justice. But even as her world grew larger, Imani never forgot where it started. And before the semester began, she took one final trip back to the café. She walked through the café doors just after opening. Same chipped tile, same flickering light above the counter. The scent of burnt coffee and cinnamon rolls hadn't changed. Neither had the morning regulars a few heads turned. But most didn't recognize her. She wasn't in uniform. No apron. No notepad tucked behind her ear. Just a young woman with quiet confidence and nothing left to prove. The manager froze when he saw her. Not with fear, with surprise. The last time he spoke to her, she was covering someone else's missed shift. Now she was walking back in as a name whispered on news shows and written into case studies. She didn't stay long, just long enough to order a coffee and leave a stack of Clear flyers by the register. No fanfare, no speech. On her way out, she paused at the corner booth where Julian Reyes had once slammed down a contract like a challenge. It looked smaller now, less like a battlefield, more like a beginning. Outside, her phone buzzed a text from one of her youth ambassadors. A teenager in Detroit had just used the app to renegotiate his first job contract. He'd saved his mom from signing a predatory loan. He wanted to say thank you. Imani didn't reply right away. She stood there, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up around her. And then, almost without thinking, she smiled. Not because she'd won, not because the fight was over, but because the world had started listening. The same world that once told her she was just a waitress. Now they were quoting her words in courtrooms, citing her app in classrooms. And somewhere, some kid who looked like her was realizing that knowledge wasn't locked behind power anymore. It was in her hands now, and she'd made sure they could hold it too.